The wind cut through the streets of New York City like icy knives. It was lunchtime near NYU, where students buzzed around, bundled up in scarves and jackets. Among the crowd, unnoticed at first, was a tall young man sitting on a park bench, quietly unpacking a brown paper bag. Barron Trump, 18 years old and known more for his last name than his personality, had just stepped out of a quiet life to attend NYU. His 6'7" frame and sharp features made him hard to miss, but he kept his head low. He'd grown tired of the whispers and the stereotypes attached to his family. Across from him, a homeless man sat huddled under layers of tattered blankets. His face was weathered, his eyes distant, but his hands trembled as he held a cardboard sign, "Hungry, please help." Students passed by, avoiding eye contact. Some glanced, then looked away. Others quickened their pace, ignoring the man's silent plea. But Barron couldn't. He stared, feeling something deep inside stir, something he hadn't felt before. Clutching his sandwich, he made a decision that would ripple through the world in ways he never imagined. Barron stood up, his lunch bag in hand. Each step toward the homeless man felt heavier than the last. Questions raced through his mind. What if he rejects me? What if someone takes a photo and twists the story? But something stronger pushed him forward. A quiet voice inside saying, "Do what's right." "Excuse me, sir," Barron said softly, his voice trembling slightly. The man looked up, startled. His gray-blue eyes locked onto Barron's. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the man's lips quivered as he said, "Yes?" Barron hesitated, then offered his sandwich, an apple, and a small bottle of water. "I thought you might need this more than me." Tears welled up in the man's eyes. His hands shook as he reached for the food. "God bless you, son," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." Barron sat down beside him, ignoring the stares from passers-by. "What's your name?" he asked. "Frank," the man replied, wiping his eyes. "I used to be someone you know. I had a family." His voice trailed off, replaced by silence heavy with unspoken pain. Barron didn't push for details. He just listened, feeling an inexplicable connection to this man who seemed so different, yet so familiar. A few students noticed the unusual scene, a Trump sitting with a homeless man, and began whispering among themselves. Some pulled out their phones to take pictures, while others watched with curiosity. Barron ignored them all. He focused on Frank, who was now slowly eating the sandwich, savoring every bite like it was a feast. "Do you have family nearby?" Barron asked gently. Frank shook his head. "They're gone," he said, his voice barely audible. "My wife passed years ago. My daughter, I haven't seen her in decades." Barron's heart ached. He thought of his own family, the privilege he'd been born into, and the loneliness that still sometimes haunted him. He couldn't explain why, but he felt compelled to help Frank. As Frank finished his meal, he looked at Barron with tears streaming down his face. "You don't know what this means to me," he said. Barron smiled faintly. "Maybe we can figure out what's next for you, Frank. Together." The whispers in the crowd grew louder, and one bystander, a young woman, called out, "Hey, are you Barron Trump?" Barron turned, his face calm but resolute. "Yes," he replied simply, surprising everyone, including himself. The moment was caught on camera, but no one could have guessed the storm it would soon unleash. The next day, Barron woke up to chaos. His phone buzzed endlessly with notifications, and when he opened it, his heart sank. A video of his interaction with Frank had gone viral overnight. The video, shared by the young woman who recognized him, had captions like "Barron Trump's heartwarming act of kindness" and "A Trump with compassion." Millions of people watched as Barron handed over his lunch and sat with Frank, listening intently to his story. The reactions were mixed. Some praised Barron, saying, "Finally a Trump who shows empathy." Others were skeptical, accusing him of doing it for publicity. But one comment caught Barron's eye. "I'm Frank's daughter. Please help me find him." Barron's chest tightened. He clicked on the profile. The woman, named Rachel, had posted a picture of her father years ago, and the resemblance was unmistakable. She wrote about how her dad had disappeared after her mom's death and how she had spent years searching for him. He stared at the comment, feeling a surge of responsibility. Could this really be Frank's daughter? He wondered. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let this end here. Barron decided to act. He messaged Rachel immediately, introducing himself and explaining the situation. Within hours, she responded, overwhelmed and desperate for answers. "Is he okay?" she asked. "Where is he now?" Barron felt a pang of guilt. He had no idea where Frank was. After their conversation the previous day, Frank had thanked him and shuffled away into the city's vastness. "I don't know," Barron admitted, "but I promise I'll find him." Rachel sent him more details about her father, a man who had once been a carpenter, loved jazz, and always carried a harmonica. She shared stories about how he used to play lullabies for her when she was a child. Her words painted a picture of a man who had been loving and kind, but had fallen into hard times after losing everything. Barron couldn't shake the thought of Frank wandering the cold streets alone. He decided to return to the spot where they had met, hoping to find him again. As he prepared to leave, a sense of urgency gripped him. Time was running out, and he couldn't fail Rachel or Frank. Barron arrived at the park near NYU, scanning every corner for Frank. The bench where they had spoken was empty, and the air was heavy with silence. He asked a few passers-by if they had seen an older man with a harmonica, but no one had any answers. The city, so vast and busy, felt like an impossible place to find one person. Barron sat down on the same bench, clutching a thermos of hot tea he had brought for Frank. He replayed their conversation in his head, wondering if he had missed any clues about where Frank might go. Just as despair began to creep in, an older woman approached him. She wore a bright red scarf and had kind eyes. "Are you looking for someone?" she asked. "Yes," Barron replied. "An older man named Frank. He was here yesterday." The woman's face softened. "I saw him earlier down by the church shelter on 14th Street. He looked tired." Hope surged in Barron's chest. "Thank you," he said, standing up. As he hurried toward the shelter, he felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Would Frank still be there? And if so, would he accept the help that Barron was determined to offer? The shelter on 14th Street buzzed with quiet activity. Volunteers handed out meals, and a few people huddled in corners trying to stay warm. Barron stepped inside, his eyes darting around the room. He held his breath, hoping to see Frank's weathered face among the crowd. A volunteer approached him, a middle-aged man with kind eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I'm looking for someone," Barron said, describing Frank. He mentioned the harmonica, his gentle demeanor, and his gray-blue eyes. The volunteer frowned thoughtfully. "I think I saw someone like that earlier," he said. "He was sitting in the corner, but I'm not sure where he went." Barron's heart sank. The shelter felt like his last lead. He thanked the volunteer and turned to leave, his hope fading with each step. As he reached the door, he heard the faint sound of a harmonica. The melody was haunting, carrying a deep sadness that stopped Barron in his tracks. He turned, scanning the room. In the corner, behind a stack of chairs, sat Frank. His hands trembled as he played, his eyes closed as if lost in a memory. Barron approached slowly, his heart pounding. "Frank," he said softly. The music stopped. Frank looked up, his face lighting up with recognition. Frank's eyes shimmered with tears as he put the harmonica down. "You came back," he said, his voice breaking. "I told you we'd figure this out together," Barron replied, sitting down beside him. Frank sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping. "It's been a long time since anyone cared enough to find me," he admitted. "You don't owe me anything, son." Barron shook his head. "It's not about owing. It's about doing what's right." For the next hour, Frank opened up about his life. He spoke of losing his wife to cancer and how grief had driven him to alcohol. He described the shame of losing his home and the unbearable pain of losing contact with Rachel, his daughter. "I wasn't a good father after her mother died," Frank confessed, tears streaming down his face. "I tried, but I failed. She deserved better." Barron listened intently, his heart breaking with every word. He thought of Rachel's comment on the video and realized how much she still cared for her father despite the years of separation. "You have a chance to make it right," Barron said gently. "Rachel's been looking for you, Frank. She wants to find you." Frank's hands shook as he covered his face, overwhelmed by emotions he had buried for years. Frank stared at Barron, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Rachel, she's looking for me," he whispered. "Yes," Barron said. "She saw the video of us and recognized you. She wants to see you, Frank." Frank shook his head slowly. "I don't deserve it. After all these years, what would I even say to her?" "You don't have to have all the answers," Barron replied. "Sometimes just showing up is enough." Frank hesitated, his fear and self-doubt written all over his face. Barron placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've been through so much, but you're still here. That means there's still hope." Together, they began to make a plan. Barron promised to reach out to Rachel and arrange a reunion. He also insisted on helping Frank find a safe place to stay until then. As they talked, the harmonica sat on the table between them, a silent reminder of the life Frank once had and the one he could still rebuild. As they stood to leave, Frank turned to Barron and said, "Thank you. I don't know why you care, but thank you." Barron smiled. "Because everyone deserves a second chance." Little did they know, the journey ahead would test them both in ways they couldn't imagine. That evening, Barron sat in his dorm room staring at his phone. Rachel had responded to his message, filled with cautious hope and overwhelming emotion. "Are you sure it's him?" she asked. "I've imagined this moment so many times, but I'm scared. What if he doesn't want to see me?" Barron hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He knew the weight of this moment for both Rachel and Frank. Finally, he typed, "He's afraid too. But I believe he wants to see you more than anything." Rachel agreed to meet them the next day at the shelter. Barron relayed the news to Frank, who sat quietly, clutching his harmonica. His face was a mixture of fear and longing. "What if she hates me?" Frank whispered. "She doesn't," Barron said firmly. "She's been searching for you, Frank. That says everything." Frank nodded, though his hands trembled. The thought of facing his daughter after decades apart felt almost unbearable. But Barron's quiet determination gave him strength. As night fell, Barron stayed with Frank, refusing to leave him alone. The shelter grew quiet, but their hearts pounded with the anticipation of what was to come. The next morning, Barron stood with Frank outside the shelter, the winter sun casting a soft glow over the city. Frank looked down at his worn boots, his breath shallow and unsteady. "She's late," Frank murmured, his voice tinged with both relief and disappointment. Barron glanced at his phone. "She'll come," he assured him. Minutes later, a young woman approached, her scarf wrapped tightly against the cold. Her face was pale, her steps hesitant. As she came closer, her eyes locked onto Frank's. "Dad?" Rachel's voice cracked as she spoke, her hands flying to her mouth. Frank's knees nearly buckled. "Rachel!" he choked out, tears spilling down his cheeks. They stood frozen for a moment, as if afraid the other might disappear. Then Rachel rushed forward, throwing her arms around her father. He clung to her, sobbing into her shoulder. "I thought I'd lost you forever," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry," Frank cried. "I failed you. I failed your mother." "You didn't fail me, Dad," she said, pulling back to look into his tear-streaked face. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Barron stepped back, watching the scene unfold, his own eyes misty. Inside the shelter, Frank and Rachel sat side by side, their hands clasped tightly as they talked. Their voices were low, filled with both pain and hope as they shared memories and tried to bridge the years of separation. Barron stayed nearby, giving them space but ready to step in if needed. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing he had played a part in this reunion. "I've missed so much," Frank said, his voice heavy with regret. "Your life, your milestones, I wasn't there." Rachel squeezed his hand. "You're here now, Dad. We can't change the past, but we can start again. For the first time in years, Frank allowed himself to believe that redemption was possible. His heart, once burdened by shame, began to feel lighter. As the hours passed, Rachel shared stories of her own struggles, of how she had never given up hope that her father was out there, somewhere. Barron watched as they laughed through their tears, the bond between them slowly rekindling. He realized this wasn't just about kindness, it was about transformation, about what could happen when people chose to care deeply. Little did he know, the world was watching closely, and this was just the beginning. As the reunion between Frank and Rachel brought tears of joy, the video of Barron's initial act of kindness continued to spread like wildfire online. People from all walks of life were drawn to the raw, unfiltered moment of humanity. The video featured Barron sharing his lunch with Frank, sitting cross-legged on the pavement outside NYU. There was no grand speech, no cameras staged. It was simple and genuine. This simplicity resonated deeply with millions. Comments flooded in. "I've always thought the Trumps were unapproachable, but Barron has shown a side of them I never expected. This isn't just kindness, it's a reminder that privilege can be used to lift others." Amid the outpouring of support, debates began. Some praised Barron for stepping outside his world of comfort. Others questioned the sincerity, arguing it was just a publicity stunt. Barron didn't respond to any of it. For him, the focus remained on helping Frank and Rachel heal. Rachel, too, was overwhelmed by the messages. Strangers encouraged her to cherish this second chance with her father, sharing their own stories of loss and reconciliation. What started as a simple gesture now had the power to change perspectives, but the journey was far from over. A week after their reunion, Frank and Rachel sat together in the shelter's community room. Barron had helped Frank get a new set of clothes and scheduled medical checkups to ensure his health was on the mend. Suddenly, the shelter's door opened, and in walked a man whose presence turned every head. It was Donald Trump. At 78 years old, his frame was as commanding as ever, though his movements carried a certain weight of time. Frank froze, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief. Donald's gaze softened as he spotted his son standing in the corner. "Barron told me about what's been happening," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I wanted to see it for myself." Barron stepped forward, his expression calm but firm. "Dad, Frank and Rachel have been through so much. They've inspired me to think differently. You need to hear their story." Donald nodded and approached Frank, extending a hand. "I'm Donald," he said simply. Frank hesitated but shook his hand. "I'm Frank," he replied, his voice trembling. What followed was an hour-long conversation, filled with heartfelt confessions and surprising empathy. Even Donald, often seen as unyielding, seemed moved by Frank's story of survival and Rachel's unwavering love. The visit from Donald Trump had a profound effect. Despite the differences in their worlds, he offered Frank an opportunity to rebuild his life. Through his connections, he promised to help Frank find a job and secure stable housing. "You've been through hell," Donald said, his tone uncharacteristically gentle, "but you're still standing. That means something." For Rachel, the moment was surreal. She had never imagined her father's path would cross with such influential people. Yet, what struck her most was not the power or wealth in the room. It was the humanity. As they prepared to leave, Barron turned to Frank and Rachel. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's just the beginning. You have a story that can inspire people. Don't let it stop here." Rachel nodded, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you, Barron, for everything." Barron smiled, his heart full. He had stepped out of his privileged bubble and discovered a deeper purpose. As the Trump family left the shelter, Frank turned to Rachel and said, "For the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe again." Neither of them knew just how much their story would continue to touch lives around the world. The days following Donald Trump's visit were transformative for Frank and Rachel. With support from Barron and his family, Frank secured a small apartment and a part-time job at a local community center. For the first time in years, he felt grounded, with hope replacing despair. Rachel, inspired by her father's resilience and Barron's kindness, began volunteering at shelters, helping families reconnect. She often spoke about her experience with her dad, encouraging others not to give up on loved ones who had lost their way. Meanwhile, the video of Barron's act continued to gain traction. Major news outlets picked up the story, sparking conversations on privilege, kindness, and the power of simple human connections. Barron stayed silent amid the praise and criticism, allowing the focus to remain on Frank's journey. But the real turning point came when Rachel was invited to speak at a conference on homelessness. Standing on stage, she shared the painful and beautiful story of finding her father again, her voice trembling with emotion. "There's more to every homeless person than their situation," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Behind every struggle is a story, a family, and a chance for redemption." The audience erupted in applause, many moved to tears. On a quiet afternoon, Barron sat in his dorm, scrolling through messages on social media. A new post caught his eye, a photo of Rachel and Frank working together at the community center. The caption read, "Because someone cared, I got my dad back." Barron leaned back, a deep sense of peace washing over him. He didn't expect the simple act of sharing his lunch to spark such a profound ripple effect. But as he reflected, he realized that kindness was contagious. It spread from one heart to another, weaving a tapestry of hope and humanity. Donald Trump, too, seemed changed by the experience. Though not one to wear his emotions on his sleeve, he quietly supported initiatives to address homelessness in New York City, inspired by Frank's story. For Frank, life wasn't perfect, but it was full. Each day was a chance to rebuild his relationship with Rachel and give back to the community that had once lifted him up. Rachel often reminded her dad of Barron's kindness. "If he hadn't sat with you that day, we might never have found each other again," she said. Frank smiled, his eyes misty. "Sometimes it just takes one person to see you." Months later, a documentary about Barron's act of kindness premiered online. It was raw and emotional, capturing every moment from that day outside NYU to Frank and Rachel's reunion. Viewers from around the world left comments, sharing their own stories of redemption and hope. Barron attended the premiere quietly, sitting in the back row. As the final scenes played, a montage of Frank smiling with Rachel, helping at the shelter, and playing his harmonica, he felt his chest tighten. When the lights came up, the director asked Barron to say a few words. He hesitated but finally stepped onto the stage. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," Barron said, his voice steady. "I saw someone in need, and I shared what I had. What's extraordinary is how kindness can grow, how one moment can change lives. This isn't about me. It's about all of us choosing to care." The audience rose to their feet, many wiping away tears. Barron's humility and sincerity touched hearts in a way words alone could not. As the credits rolled, a message appeared: "Kindness is free, pass it on." If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories. Your comments mean the world to me, so share how this touched your heart. Let's spread kindness together. Thank you.